a universal psychological need is mastery of skill. Everybody wants to get better at something. It's just where are they going to have their focus?
This is From Paint to Purpose, a podcast by FCP Services, where we believe people drive growth, exploring topics related to company culture, leadership, and construction industry insights. Now your host, John Barsness.
Welcome, everybody, to our latest podcast today from Paint to Purpose. My guest today is just a wonderful leader. She has joined us graciously early this morning in her world. And so I would like to introduce Melissa Freigang to all of our listeners. She is a powerhouse leader out of Utah who is doing some wonderful work to help change the world as we look at it, especially for people's lives. So, Melissa, thank you so much for joining us today. And why don't you tell us and our listeners a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, well, first off, thank you so much for the invitation. I'm truly honored, and I'm looking forward to the conversation today. So just a little high-level overview of my career. I actually started in athletics. So I'm a first-generation college student. And the only reason I had an opportunity to go to university was because my parents, who really were the first generation to work my family out of intergenerational poverty, which is kind of a new concept right now, and we can certainly deep dive that concept later in the podcast. But I went to university because I had a physical talent, and so it afforded me opportunities in my lifetime. And when I was there, I was on a full ride scholarship, but really in college, a full ride scholarship. I want to say, I think my first year that I was there, and this was a long time ago, I got $125 a month to live on, right, for food and rent. And I think it moved to $175 after that. But, that's not a lot of money to get by. And so I had administrators who, beyond coaches and beyond your teachers and faculty, really helped me access Pell Grants and, all of the different financial services and books and tutoring services and support services that I needed to be successful. And so when I, really early on, when I started having that assistance, I realized that, these individuals were really paying it forward. They were the team behind the team. And I decided that's what I wanted to be. And so I got my first start at Gonzaga University in Spokane, Washington. I was an academic coordinator, and I took care of my athletes in the same way that I was taken care of. And I did compliance, and, I was a senior woman administrator and did Title IX and all of those administrative pieces, but really just took care of athletes and ran a student athlete advisory committee, and the life skills portion was really my favorite part of that. And then I moved to Weber State University as the associate athletics director. And I had a number of hats there. I administered sports, and I did all the events, including, the band competitions and football and basketball and volleyball and you name it. I did all the game management. But on top of that, I did more of the internal operations and the student athlete welfare portion of that as well. And then I actually moved to an organization called the Clearfield Job Corps Center. And so that's a Department of Labor, and I worked for Management and Training Corporation. They're a private company that operates the Job Corps Center. We're the third largest in the nation, and I was there for almost a decade. And we really did admissions, business, and community, where we would onboard 45 students a week from 6 different states. And then we would place 90 students or graduates a month in jobs in those 6 states. By the time we were done, and the time I exited to an industry placement, I had 40% direct placements. So, meaning that they didn't have to go back and find a home. We were hiring them directly from the center. And work-based learning experiences, and really looking at that flow and systems. And I know this isn't necessarily high level. I'm kind of diving into micro, but I feel like it's important, for the next hour to lay some context. And then I went to industry, and we were the only private company that went after federal dollars. They're called Temporary Assistance for Needy Families, or TANF is the short name for them. And we were the first in Utah, anyway, for TANF funds to win an RFP. And I designed an intervention that I called job training and placement, where we would really try to access these individuals that were underemployed, right? This concept that maybe they were highly qualified or had education or maybe had lots of experience, but maybe 3 jobs, and they just couldn't quite get that next career move to wages sufficient to move them up that next socio-economic level. So we actually placed and worked with about 300 individuals, moving them up that chain. And really what we focused on was just the employability skills, childcare and healthcare. And right, it's typically for employers, not the skill level, because our universities and our training, post-secondary and, both our technical training institutions and our higher ed institutions are phenomenal. And our high schools, right, they're phenomenal. And so when people are accessing all of the educational institutions, they're coming out with just a phenomenal amount of skills. It's typically the employability skills, right, that you hire on paper, for qualifications, but you fire on personality or showing up late or, all of those different things. And so we really identified and defined employability skills. And while I was there, we worked with the University of Utah on a concept called the Utah Materials and Manufacturing Initiative. Advanced Materials and Manufacturing Initiative, UAMI, and helped found and start an industry organization, association that still thrives today, which is kind of cool in the composites world in Utah and northern Utah specifically. All of that said, it was really all, from my perspective, focused around workforce development and employability skills. And then I started consulting for Weber County on intergenerational poverty. And I think the whole time, all of my career has been taking these populations and really understanding the systems that they have to navigate, and then how to gap fill and how to really deep dive from a human-centered design, but looking at the systems. Right. So you're looking at that bookend continuum. And so I take these populations, whether they're lower socioeconomic or poverty, or you take, student athletes in a year from inner city or highly privileged, high socioeconomic athletes. But you take these groups and you figure out what's going to make them successful. And then you give them the opportunities and the resources to make that happen. And, in a nutshell, I feel like that's what equity is. I think a lot of people have different terms for equity. I believe equity is holding everybody accountable to the same expectations, but then giving them the means to meet those expectations or, opportunities.
Well, that's fantastic. And I think what you just spoke to, especially as it relates to that employability and the gaps, right? We as an organization work with, our industry in the construction space is traditionally anyway, a lot of labor that is either learned on the job or through a trade school. What we find, though, with many of our folks is that it's not the skills, as you pointed out, that they struggle with or can't learn. It's the basic things of any time something in their life changes, even minutely, everything else is impacted, including being able to show up to work on time or being able to just navigate those bumps in the road that so many others are able to do and take for granted. If childcare falls through, they might have a support system at home or an emergency that they can solve for themselves. Many of the people that we work with and who dedicate their lives to working for our organization, those are things that they just can't navigate. And what we found is the more that we can provide them some of those tools, the better they are for not only our organization, but what we find is that they have an opportunity to actually see significant impact for their world around them. So that really resonates with me because we do see that every day. We try to figure out how do we help people navigate some of the things that just are life crushing, and they're not even the things that often get heard, right? So we talk about high unemployment, or we talk about livable wages, and all those things are true and real, but much of what happens there and leads up to that is all of the things that aren't talked about. And I think those are the things that you guys are addressing on a regular basis, which is how do people navigate and help find ways to use the resources that are all around them, both government and private industry. And for me, that's one of the things that I think we have an obligation to do as an organization is, yes, we're for profit. Yes, we need to make a profit. And there's nothing wrong with that as an organization. But what we do with that is to me most important, because if we're giving people the opportunity to have the same experiences that many of us have had and opportunities, then it's our job to make sure that they can succeed when they get those opportunities. So I guess tell me a little bit about how you've been able to even use your unique skill set of bridging that gap between policy and practice, because so much of what you're talking about, especially in working with people who may not have those life skills kind of buttoned up as they walk into the employment arena, it's a practical issue. It's not a matter of just sitting around a table and talking about theory. It's how do we put this into practice so that organizations can help support the organization like yourself that are running, but also how to connect with some of the resources that the government already provides, so we're not reinventing the wheel.
Right. Yeah, that's a big question. And so I'll try to unpack that. So, I work off the philosophy of, so really my foundation is operational excellence. So whether you're looking at that in a social organization, right, a service-based organization, or a for-profit organization, we all have to have very efficient systems. But in that, you have to have a human-centered design. So you have to, right? So the system has to be flexible and malleable enough to fit the humans that are accessing it, right? So, it's, again, sort of that continuum, that bookend piece. So what we do is, with these select populations, whether we're looking at intergenerational poverty or we're looking at reentry, right, into the community, or reintegration, or homelessness, or even just, there's a lot of intergenerational poverty families, and you kind of mentioned this, that are, they never show up on the radar because they never access state assistance. So they're not viewed as in poverty, yet they're just always on that tipping point, right? Or that cliff, so to speak. So one bad thing happens and it can be catastrophic because they're always at risk or vulnerable. So, the way we look at it is, a lot of people assign if, somebody's not showing up on time, they'll automatically make assumptions. And those assumptions are that person's not motivated. But when you really drill down a motivation, and, we're going back to biology or psychology 101 here, but that's really Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? That's the theory of motivation. So we're getting into the sort of science pieces of this. And and I'm sure you already know Maslow's hierarchy of needs, but, for those who maybe aren't as familiar with it, it's basically sort of this foundational pyramid where they say, you take care of the physiological needs of people: safety, security, food, water, etc. And then you sort of move up this scale, and then you have universal psychological needs. And I think we always, especially in our social services, think through and fund as a society all of those physiological needs, but we never address any of the psychological needs, right? And so I think we piecemeal it in as an employer. For example, we might say, oh, well, let's do internships, right? But why do internships work? It doesn't necessarily work because you are teaching somebody a physical skill set. right? It works because they create a relationship with someone that, maybe becomes their proxy mom or dad, right? Or somebody that cares about them, right? And so that's one of the universal psychological needs of belonging, right? They start to belong to your culture. And so I think there's a lot of things that employers already do, but I don't think they translate that to the human being, right? And the universal psychological needs of belonging, mastery of skill, and autonomy, right? So no matter where you live, where you're born, which family you're born to, what socioeconomic class, we all have those universal psychological needs. And so I think as employers, if we can start to think through our system being able to address those universal psychological needs, those are the employers that absolutely do the best. And then it allows you, right? They say trust the process versus the end product, which is accurate, right? Like if you can base your system on that, and I think that's what really great HR directors do. And that's what we call the employability skills, right? Like you find out not only do individuals have the childcare or the medical coverage or, those sorts of things, but when they start to belong and they start to have a mentor and a role model, they start to adapt to your company's culture. And when that happens, the world opens up for them, right? And so what I would suggest, though, at that point is I think a lot of times when you get someone, a diamond in the rough, so to speak, and they start to really flourish, they start to do a great job in that position. And I think what employers could probably look at is how do we build that person to the next level? Even though maybe it took a couple of years and a mentor, how do we develop those systems to get that person up and promoted, right? So that you have this pathway within this one employment or this employer, right? Not just workforce development. And so I think something really important to talk about as well is when everybody talks about workforce development, I think we use that synonymously. And I think that that's an error for government to use that word. I think workforce development fits very, very well for an employer. I think that's exactly what an employer does is they develop that person, they develop the people, right, in their pipeline, and that's workforce development. I think for those of us out in the community, like Maya Angelou says, words matter. We need to start talking about labor utilization, right? Do we have every single person in our community, right, in the labor force? And I think if we did nothing but teach people how to use the right language, I think that would really guide all of this work, not necessarily for employers, because I think employers already get it and they know that, but I think from a social services position, I feel like we would translate the language even tighter so it'd be easier for employers to access social service organizations. So I feel like there's a big gap in understanding, knowledge, lexicon, right? And if we can start to just break down those bridges, I feel like that's where we really start to see a lot of that intersectionality. And then I'll just say one more thing. When you're talking about communities, they're ecosystems, right? That our community today is not what it was yesterday or the day before or the day before, and it's not going to be what it is 20 years from now. And so, the work that I'm trying to do is not just short term, it is absolutely, but we're also looking at, the 5-year-old. What's going to be, the ability for that 5-year-old in this ecosystem, right? So again, I'm going from system and operational excellence, right? That efficiency piece, barriers, gaps, etc. And then the human walking through it, right? Whether that's a short-term endeavor or a long-term endeavor. And so when you're looking at, a lot of people talk about an ecosystem or economic development or community development as the people, infrastructure, and industry, right? Like if you think of it as a triangle. But they're not siloed, right? So when you look at all three, industry will say, well, we need labor, we need a workforce. Well, that's really a people issue, right? And so at the people issue, if you call it labor utilization, right, then you get more people who are not in the labor force. And education is great, and vote, or they don't call it vote training anymore. That's how old I am. Tech training, right? On the job training, work-based learning. Those are all pathways we've talked about. But we assign education, for example, in the people place. Well, I don't. I think that education is infrastructure. And even though infrastructure can also be bricks and mortar and roads, right? Like, of course, that's what it is. But if we don't start viewing education as a fundamental right, the wealth gap is going to continue. And so, I feel strongly we have to find a way to get our youth and our adults actually into post-secondary, but not charge as much, right? So that they don't pick up these loans and create this more vulnerability for them. And, anymore, a bachelor's degree is almost the equivalent of what a high school diploma was way back when, right? And if you read Putnam's work, he talks about the wealth gap and how to solve it. And I think his work is phenomenal. And so, I won't dive into that rabbit hole. But, when we're thinking about the ecosystem, and the Socio-Ecological Model, and I'm not sure if you're familiar with that, but it's sort of, right, it starts with the individual, and then it goes to the interpersonal relationships, and then it goes to the institutional, right? And that's where employers lie, right? Like that's where they engage theoretically. And then you go to the community level. Well, at the community level, there's coalitions, but they don't typically have teeth, if you will, right? They're not typically tasked with the good of the community. Even if they are the backbone for talking about, say, food security, typically it's a nonprofit, but that nonprofit's number one mission is to maintain their organization, right? And yes, they want to do good, and that's awesome, but their number one is that they have to exist, right? Whereas the Center of Excellence, I'm super lucky because I get to be a public entity, right, with commissioners. And so I'm a combination of, I report directly to our county commission. I also report directly to our human services. So Weber Human Services, which is behavioral health. And then I also report to the Weber Morgan Health Department. So I get to operate in these different universes, but they shouldn't be different, right? Because social determinants of health are really some of those employability issues, which is really just economic development. It's just that we have this different language. So I live in that community space, and then you have policy on top of that. And so I hope I'm getting through to you. Like, this is all, to me, I'm jumping back and forth between science and then practice, right? What the theory is, and then how do you apply it? And so intergenerational poverty is child-centric, very specifically, right? And then we have 2-gen strategies, right? Which is that interpersonal, because we know children have to have at least one parent that they feel safe with and can talk to. But they have to have at least one meaningful adult relationship that's non-parental, right? So how do you, at a government, like in a public system, how do you codify that? Right? That's really hard to do. And we can talk about this later, like social determinants of health or ACEs, but we're still looking at the universal psychological needs of children, and how does that parlay into employability skills and workforce development, right, in 20 years. And so the socio-ecological system and the community development, if we can start to take those, and even though they have lines in them or they have, buckets, it doesn't mean that the model means that you have to talk about each of those separately. In practice, we have to adopt those and come from that framework as we're thinking through the efficiency, right? And instead of it being linear, we have to think in, I think, 4 dimensions, right? So and this is the last thing I'll say, and then I'll give you a chance to talk.
You're
so
good.
I'm sorry.
You're good.
I always try to think through, in terms of our system, the healthcare model. You have to diagnose what's wrong, right? So you do your SWOTs or, whatever you want to call them, gap analysis or, systems analyses. So you have to diagnose what's wrong, and then you have to figure out the right treatment at the right time and in the right dosage. And those two, right? Like, we might figure out what the strategy is, right, in terms of the right treatment or the tactics, but we never, ever talk about the right time and the right dosage, ever, ever. I don't think, whether you're an employer or your social services. And so when we can start to talk through all of those dimensions, I think that that's what will take us to the next level.
Well, that's you can feel the passion that you have for it, but I also think one of the things I heard very clearly, and certainly correct me if I'm wrong on this, but one of the things I heard very clearly, if I think of this from the lens of an employer's viewpoint, is we must engage in all of those areas as an employer in a community, within a community, meaning we work, like for us, we are a nationwide company. So our folks come from all over the country. Each of their communities, socioeconomic and otherwise, have their own ecosystem. We have our own ecosystem as an organization and as an industry, and yet all of those things that matter to people are universal. And we have to find a way to plug into each of those things. And I think one of the things I look at often, because I balance both being trained as an HR professional for many years, but being a business owner and a business executive for most of my career, it's really taking all of the things that matter to us, which is creating a space for people to flourish in our organization, and interweaving that into how we make money. Because if we're doing those things effectively, then we are providing people the opportunity, which is what you just talked about, especially around the equity. For me, is I think you described that so clearly with what we really need to think about what equity looks like, which is providing people the opportunity that both comes with the timing and the ability to actually harness those opportunities for flourishing in their own way. And everybody comes at that in a different way. So even in intergenerational poverty, yes, we start with a child-centric model, but they only find ways to think about that differently when their parents, or next generations they're viewing it and seeing it themselves. So from an employer standpoint, I may not have a direct link to that child necessarily, but I certainly do to their parent. And if I can help them see life differently and opportunities differently, because I can present them with those things through the work that they do, which adds value to them and to us as a employer and to our customers, we've now created a layer in which we can start to fundamentally change our ecosystems, both in our company and in the communities that we live. And so I think, and this is there's no easy answer to it, certainly, but I think it starts with us as business leaders to say our job is much more than just providing an opportunity, a job for somebody, a wage for somebody. Those are all, to me, those are fundamental. You just do what's right because it's the right thing to do. We need to take that a step further and say, how do we help people envision a future that they never thought of when they walked in our doors the first time? And that's what motivates me to look at how do we structure that as an organization. Every decision we make has to be made with the flourishing in mind. We've actually talked about this as an organization. One of the things that I'm starting to do with one of the teams that I manage is to create a centers of excellence mindset without the traditional organizational design of centers of excellence. Like, those are all good things, but it really is about creating the center of excellence for how we help people flourish. And each level of the organization is empowered to find out what that looks like. And then we look at, well, what organizations are around us that we can partner with and find ways to make it a both and winning combination. Because right now we are all facing the challenge of how do we fill our pipeline with qualified people. But I also look at it and say, the skills I can train, I can do that every day. That's not my issue. It's finding the people who fit and want those opportunities within our culture, and then we can give them all the skills and training that they need. Everybody wins when we do that, because our clients are happy. We're making money as an organization, which means we can keep functioning. So I just, what you described is I think something that if we can come together as a group of business owners and leaders, we can start to partner with organizations like yourself and other community organizations and the government and say, let's not think about this in our own silos. Let's think about this as a collective group. And how do we go about doing that? So tell me a little bit about, from your perspective, how you've been able to bring private organizations to become part of that solution for intergenerational poverty and creating those opportunities for people so that we can bring that labor force into a place where people can actually flourish and find success, and that the things that matter most to people, which is security, safety, and an opportunity to belong, all function within those ecosystems by providing livable wages for people. That's a part of that safety and security. We forget that sometimes. And I think sometimes we get into the argument of the dollar amount as opposed to what it actually means.
Yeah. So again, a big one to unpack. I took lots of notes. So, but I'll try to be succinct because I think, the answer isn't complicated. Right? It doesn't mean it's easy, but it's really not complicated at all. It's quite simple, just hard to do. So, and at the end of the day, it always comes down to funding. I mean, it just is what it is. And so, my first gut reaction, and this is something that I am challenged with, is I still have to find funding to do the work that I do, right? To keep my team on board and to do this work. And so I would say that the number one thing is to really think outside the box what companies are doing with their money. And, sometimes it can, I don't know, I've heard people describe it as monopoly money, right? Like when you look at the cost to recruit and retain, right? That can be upwards to 50,000 to 100,000, depending on the position, right? And that's not an exaggeration. But what happens if you take that 100,000 for that one person and you have 5 interns that you hire with, right? Like as 10 hours a piece, that then you recruit that one person who is the fit, right? That you don't just give them a 2-week trial. You actually can take 5 that you give an opportunity to. It doesn't mean that the 4 don't get the opportunity. They've been given the opportunity with a letter of recommendation and, some skill sets and also maybe some constructive criticism, like, you really need to take a shower every day or, something like that. It can be as simple as that. And that can be, a lot of times, and I don't care what socioeconomic class you're talking about, there are some people who have never been taught to brush their teeth every day. And that's not a judgment. It is what it is, right? Because when you are maybe coming from a family who has a parent who works 3 jobs, they don't have the resource of time, right? And energy. And, I think a lot of people might look down upon somebody like that, but that's, you can really literally change somebody's life by just providing feedback, right? And if you can always come at it with the best of intentions, you can provide feedback to anybody. That's my philosophy. So it can be weird, right? Or maybe a little uncomfortable. But as an HR person, I'm sure you've had lots of conversations that like that. But, I think
unfortunately, yes.
Yeah, but I think it's building a culture on our teams where that person's yours. It doesn't have to be the HR person, right? Why have it escalate to that point, right? Have everybody have this sense of belonging to have, maybe this individual who's been there for 10 years, put their arm around someone. And I know there's our HR issues with that too, right? But in the right way, hey, let me just provide you some feedback. I love you to death. You're doing great on XYZ. I think you could go even further if you did, LMNOP, right? So that's a big piece. And then I think we really, really have to understand that a universal psychological need is mastery of skill. Yes. Everybody wants to get better at something. It's just where are they going to have their focus, right? So even if you have somebody who's involved in the justice system and they're involved in crime, they still try to do it the best that they can, right? And so, people laugh at me to use that analogy, but it's a universal psychological need. So I think if we can get out of our stereotypes, right, and really think outside the box, and when we look at our labor force, our workforce, and we think workforce development, I think if we can just make our assumptions that everybody wants to do a great job, we just have to give them the tools. And a lot of times that tool is just plain feedback, right?
Yeah.
And that can be really uncomfortable. But if we can make that a pervasive culture, a norm, right, among all of our people to be done in the right way. And I know that can be, if you don't have the right culture or environment, that can get pretty tricky. But I think if you have this culture and everybody comes from that place that we all belong to this one team, right? That's what I learned in athletics.
Yeah.
I think that's what, when you hire athletes, that's what they come with embedded, right? Well, we have to give everybody that opportunity, whether they've been athletes or not, to belong to a team and really look at it in that team level, right? And I think that's the system. Right? We can talk culture, we can talk big picture or system, but that's sort of the micro unit when you think down that socio-ecological chain, right? If you put your company in the socio-ecological model, right? And I don't think people do that.
Right.
But I think that's where, if I were a business owner, I'd start there first, right? Is really try to map out, what does this look like? What is our ecosystem? Because you might think but I venture a guess that you might have some gaps, right?
Yeah.
And then the other pieces of this, which I think are gigantic, is yes, it's about wage. Yes, right? And that's political, and there's all sorts of, minimum wage and what does that look like? But I would say right now, I always think, let the powers be, right? Like that's going to be what it is, right? And but what I would do with my $100,000, right, or $50,000, let's say, is I would start to reinvest that. So I would look at, how do I pay for potentially workforce housing? How do I get childcare? Or how do I partner with a childcare service provider, right, to help my employees? Because I'm going to know what their socioeconomic status is. So I'm going to know if they're 200% of poverty. And then I'm going to know if they're eligible for X, Y, or Z. And then I'm going to know which organization I want to partner with, right? Because that's the standard of eligibility, let's say. I'm talking hypothetically.
Right.
But if they're eligible for that and you partner with that agency, then that agency can actually provide them free childcare, right? Like, it's accessing all the resources all the way down the line, because when families are at risk, they're just surviving.
Yes.
I mean, and huge kudos to them, right?
Right.
To just get food on the table. And that's a heavy lift. It's hard. So when we're talking about, you use the word envision, I would add maybe empower, right? And I would say that if our employers can start to have that mindset shift, right? And it's not just up to them. If our service providers can start to think through, what is it that we need for labor utilization, not workforce development, right?
Right.
Then that's what I call, and the work I do with community resilience, right? So, we know what resilience is, but people don't typically talk about community resilience. And it's, how do you come back from COVID, right? And how do you bounce back from recessions or whatever you need to bounce back from. And I look at that specifically with our intergenerational poverty group. What we do is our families typically don't have the social capital. So typically when you hire or when you get a job, right, especially for me, it's been who you know. So, my first job, I didn't know anyone, but I called the person every week for 6 months until I got the job, right? And got made fun of it. He said he hired me because he was afraid of what I would do if he didn't, right? But other than that, in some ways I got to know him, right? So it was who you know. And so when we have communities where we have talent and we want to go recruit from those communities, we can get more individuals from those communities when we create a system of social capital for them. It's a who you know.
Right.
So when you have someone who maybe you've recruited out of a certain environment, right, you can get 5 to 10 more, because word of mouth is well, and you guys do marketing, right? Word of mouth is the way to do everything. And that's really social capital. And, we can get down into social capital. There's 3 types and there's the science behind it. And, I work with a really, really smart gentleman. His name is Dr. Ben Gibbs at BYU here in Utah. And we meet every other week. And he deep dives social bonding and all of that. And he's just brilliant. And I'm super lucky to have my social capital, right, of people helping me. But when we think of that, our individuals who are in a certain population, that is their social capital. And so they're only going to be accessing the resources that they know about at the time. So if we can really bridge that gap, I think that's really important as employers. And I think reaching out to those social organizations, the social, and here's what I'll say about that. I would say one of the mindset shifts that's the absolute most important is getting what they call upstream, right? So a lot of times employers are dealing with downstream impacts of the social challenges that we're dealing with. But if an employer can really think through upstream, and what I want to say to that is there are lots of evidence-based practices that you could access for free out of your public behavioral health, right? They have a prevention. Every community is a little bit different in terms of the system, but here in Weber County, we have Weber Human Services, and they're connected to the Department of Human Services in the state of Utah. And so when you follow that system down, there are evidence-based practices for suicide prevention, for emotion coaching, right? Mostly for children, but it's helping parents learn those skill sets and parenting skill sets, because what that does is that creates a more stable family environment. So if you can start to even think through parenting skills for your parents, right? Suicide prevention, substance abuse prevention, right? Opioids is a huge issue for a ton of our communities, and it crosses socioeconomic barriers, right? And it impacts our employers. So, when we're thinking that, we do a lot of, the temporary assistance, which is fantastic for Anyway, I forgot the EAC or whatever, the insurance is on the backside. But if we can start to get as upstream as possible with the human, right, understanding what some of these issues are, the further upstream we can do, the more prevention we're doing, the more investing we're doing instead of cost down the road. And theoretically, when you're doing that, then you're starting to retain employees, right? Because you're working on not only their housing, for example, or if you figure out childcare for them, or you figure out medical costs, right? I would say if every employer could always offer a benefits package, even if you didn't have a huge wage, the benefits package plus some sort of housing package plus some sort of childcare package of some sort, right? Whether it's childcare on site or some partnership or something, I would say those are way more important now than wages. Just like allowing people flexibility, almost way more important than wages. And I know, a lot of industries don't have that luxury, but when you do, I would just say, especially learning from COVID, if we can learn to allow for that family, that life, work, family balance, I think that that's really critical, and not to silo, but we have to see these individuals not just as their family, but as individuals. And people need time. They just need their own time sometimes, right? And so I think those are really important. So theoretically, there's several psychological and physiological needs, and I've just listed them all, right? In different examples. So, back from science to practice. But I think you could create a self-sustaining model with your recruitment dollars and your retention dollars if you start to invest those upstream, because I think that will pay dividends. And you'll never capture the cash, but you will, I think, have so much better of a culture. You won't have a problem finding people. You'll have better fits. You won't have as much turnover, right? It's having trust and faith in that process, not necessarily the product. And then I think that, like you said, the profit comes, right? Yeah. Or the problems solve themselves almost. So sorry, you asked one more question, and how do we do it? So what I do with our intergenerational poverty families is we have what we call resource integration coaches. And those resource integration coaches are not social workers. They're typically lived experience peers. They can be your best friend, or they can be your kick in the butt, right? It kind of depends. But what they have is one individual at every agency, the service providers. So at your one stop, at your behavioral health, at your health department, right? And what we do is we have that resource integration coach who is the instant social capital for that family. So that family will ask them to say, okay, parents, ask yourself, what do I need, right, to get to that next level? And we build their family resilience. And I have a metric, with tons of indicators that, the way we measure that at baseline and in progress, because data is absolutely phenomenally critical, right? And I do outcomes, not outputs, and a lot of people do outputs, right?
Yeah.
So there's a difference there. But then what we do is we have those agencies that we're partnered with. They've actually modified the way they do business so that they have one person to work with our families. And it's literally, we've been able to, so our mission for children is to create an environment where all children can exercise the power of self-determination, right? So that's that long-term, if they want to be an engineer, what are those barriers, right? Long-term. And then we build family resilience, excuse me, which is the 2Gen, right? Strategies. And then that's actually our community resilience. And if we can get our employers and our service providers and our community-based organizations all understanding the social capital for these particular families, all of a sudden you have quite a bit of community resilience, right? And you're starting to change your labor utilization at the really high macro level. And, a lot of people, when they hear me talk, they're like, oh, I'm so overwhelmed, right? Like you have, generational homelessness or generational incarceration, but like I said, it's really just eating the elephant one bite at a time. And when you understand both the theory and the practice, and you just start to take action, which is why we call it integrated community action now, or I can, right? Because nobody wants to belong to a poverty program. Like that's not nice, but words matter. So when you get into an I can program, that's super meaningful. And so I would just encourage employers to reach out to partners, but not in the traditional sense. Right. Really deep dive your humans and understand what resources they have available, because I guarantee there are a ton. And it's not difficult in today's day and age with the wages to beat 200% of poverty. And you can figure that out just by going online. You go to Health and Human Services, you can see household size, and it breaks it down by wage, right? And you can see if somebody's in poverty and what degree of poverty they're in. And then you can go access these service providers. They will be elated, right, to be visiting with you, because they try to get to you. But that's a huge system, right? And they can't get to everybody. So if an employer gets a little bit savvy, you could have so many resources wrapped around this family, and your HR person could literally be a resource integration coach, right? And that would be so helpful to someone. And you would never have to necessarily, depending on the position, necessarily look at wage. And I guarantee you that even though when you start to have these industry wage competitions, right, they leave for one place for a quarter more and then they come back for a quarter more, right? Instead of having that competition, when you start to provide some of these other opportunities like parenting skills and nights out with your children, right? Like we know that right now for children, it's the adverse childhood experiences, right? We call them ACEs, and I'm not sure if you're familiar with those, but we can deep dive those later if you want. But there's also adverse community experiences. So if you live in places with poverty, or if you live in economically distressed areas with no opportunities, right? Or no grocery stores, or, right? Those can be considered ACEs. But we know that resilience trumps ACEs. And resilience can be having a best friend, having, a parent, that you feel safe with and can talk to, and having these what we call advantageous childhood experiences. So when we can start to have our parents in a 2-gen strategy even start to have time with their children, that literally will pay dividends for a community and economic development, for the next really short term, right? From an employability standpoint, because you stabilize that family. And our numbers show, so we keep school absenteeism, we keep literacy, numeracy, we keep all of those indicators. And every single one of our children, when you stabilize that family, every single one of them gain. And we don't have a literacy program. We don't have a numeracy program. All we're doing is stabilizing the family, but that adult becomes a better worker, right? And that child goes into the classroom ready to learn. And then the programs that we're paying for as taxpayers, right? It allows the teachers, these wonderful, wonderful teachers, to not go out of their swim lane, right? They get to then teach. And so that, again, is sort of this macro level community resilience. And it sounds, so indirect as I hear it come out of my mouth, but it works. And I have the evidence to prove it, which is super fun, right? To have the data behind the theory now.
Well, and I think that, you talked about we have to eat the elephant one bite at a time. I think in many cases, especially for employers, we know our demographics. We know the cultures and the communities that they live in. And again, in most of them, there are 1 or 2 primary drivers for why people are struggling. And so for us as an employer, if we know those things, if we are in tune with that, we can take that one bite and we are doing our part. We're not going to solve it all. That's not our job. However, it is something that we can influence. So like for us, we know in our industry, there is a high level of alcoholism. There is a high level of drug use. And so as we understand that, we not only can partner with those people in that lane, because we're also attracting people who might be coming from that and saying, I can't get a job anywhere else because nobody will hire me. We look at it and say, well, we'll give you a chance, because we not only have a built-in support system, because we have a lot of recovering alcoholics and folks that are struggling with that. So once they get to a stabilized position in their own life, they want to give back, and we can introduce people into our environment because we're capable of managing and helping them learn those skills to cope with and overcome some of the challenges that might trip them up. And so I would encourage every other employer too that is listening to this, your demographic, those challenges, solve that. Don't worry about solving the other 10 things that are real and that are important, but aren't in your lane either to solve, because that's not where you can make the impact. Because I do believe that it is that stabilization. When we can provide as an employer a place where the people who work for us, whether they are single parents, whether they are in a intact family, if you will, or whether they are single and with no kids and are early on in their careers, if we can provide them with that stability, that mushrooms out across the community. And so that's where I guess I look at it and say, we can do our part, and it may be small or it may be big or it may be in between, but we need to step up and do something, because and by the way, from a selfish standpoint as an employer, it helps us too. It's not as if it has to be altruism all the way through, because that's not real either. The reality is there are hard facts for everybody, and we all have to do something to provide, whether that's, as you talked about, funding for your own programs. You need to find that funding. That's the reality. For us, we have to make a profit. That's our reality. But what we do with it and how we go about doing those things, I think, matters. It's why we talk about that in our culture so much. We live our culture through our values, and those exude everything that we do. And I think it's also recognizing that we're not perfect. And I think when we can walk into a room and people can look at maybe the position I hold or the assumptions they make about me because of those things, and think, well, I can never get there because I don't have this or that. And we can both walk into the room together and go, yeah, we can help each other, because listen, I'm going to stumble and fall on my face tomorrow too. And I have my own tripwires. They may be different than yours, but I got them. And we just got to learn how to navigate those. I've been fortunate in my life. I've been given the opportunities, but I also took advantage of the opportunities I was given. And so I always challenge people that way too, is that, I didn't stumble into this because I got lucky as much as I got opportunity. And I had a lot of people surrounding me that gave me the kick in the butt when I needed it, but also the hug when I needed it too. So, I would say we're kind of coming up to our time, and I want to be respectful of that for everybody. But I'd leave it kind of as a last for you to any lasting comments or suggestions for employers that might be listening to this and thinking, I don't know how I'm going to integrate this in, but I want to. Some lasting words of wisdom, I suppose, for our audience.
Yeah, John, thank you. And I also want to be mindful, so I'll be brief. I think I'll try to be brief. I warned you at the beginning. So what I would say is I think that employers currently, they all want to do their part with corporate responsibility. I think you're right at the beginning of the podcast. I think maybe they just don't know how, or they think what they're doing is working and they're really, really trying. And what I would say is you were spot on in your last comments. And one of the things I've learned is control the controllables. You can't control what the outcome is necessarily, right? But you can control what you put into it. And I live by that mantra. Like, you take care of you and do what you can, and the results will come. And, I think this corporate responsibility can't be what the trend is. You have to look internally and see what fits your organization and what fits your humans, whether it's the leadership humans, right? What fits what they want to do. And your demographics, you're spot on. Those individuals, you can have a peer, but if they don't have a peer that is successfully recovered, they're going to be appreciative, right? But they're not going to really feel like they belong. They're going to feel like they're different. So I think that's really insightful of you. And then the last thing I would do is, from a profit perspective, you don't have to necessarily sell more widgets to gain a profit, right? You can reduce costs to increase that net, right? So I would just push for that. And I would say, from a human perspective, when you're thinking about your employees, look at things like, get a piece of paper out and they say, if someone is spending more than 30% of their income, right, or 30% of AMI, average median income, right, then that's too much, right? They're going to struggle. And I would say, look at your positions and have a page per position, per wage, right? And then define that by household size. So for an individual, they're making this wage, right? Are they 30% of right, the area median income for a one bedroom? Just literally look at the numbers. And I think if you look at the numbers, it's going to just really expose all the different things. Like, all of a sudden, I think your teams or people working on this will see, like, oh, well, we could do that. Oh, we could do that. We could do that. We could do that, right? So I think no matter what, you just keep peeling back the layers of the onion, because there's always more to do and to realize. But I just think that we have to look at our efficient systems in a human-centered design methodology. And if you can do just that, I think that it will pay massive dividends for employers, for individuals and families, long-term, short-term, and our communities. It will just make our communities way more resilient. And thank you so very much for inviting me. Well, I appreciate the time.
Thank you. This has been fantastic.
Thank you, John. It was super fun to talk to you today.
Thanks for listening. To learn more, visit fcpservices.com. Until next time, Remember, people drive growth.